So let me just give a brief overview. First of all, I'd recommend to you that you look at the presidency's paper that is now up on the website, the UNFCCC website, the Indaba Overview paper, which was the basis for discussions last night, we understand, among about 50 representative countries. She identifies three gaps, which I think is a good way of thinking about this. First, the ambition gap. The gap between the 2-degree temperature increase that governments agreed to try to stay under in Copenhagen 2 years ago, and the pledges that are now on the table, which fall well short of meeting that goal. The finance gap, the need to scale up finance from the current $10 billion a year towards the $100 billion a year by 2020 that was promised in Copenhagen. And the implementation gap by strengthening and maintaining the legally binding framework, including the Kyoto Protocol, implementing existing commitments, and operationalizing the Cancun agreements from last year. So I think that's a way to think of the overall framing. There's also questions she raises about what the bodies ought to be going forward from these negotiations, particularly do the current AWGs on the Kyoto Protocol and long-term cooperative action continue, or do you go back to working through the subsidiary bodies and maybe establish a new body to look at some of these legal and review issues? I think overall we're at sort of the state where we usually are in these negotiations with the technical issues. Negotiations are moving well on some less political issues, such as adaptation and RED. As you know, the two SBs, the Subsidiary Body for Implementation and Science and Technological Advice, will wrap up tonight with their closing plenaries. We expect those plenaries to go quite late into the evening. Unfortunately, some of those negotiators may miss the NGO party, but that doesn't mean that you all can't come. On the long-term cooperative agreement section, you saw the text was tabled by Chair Dan Riefsnyder this morning, and he provided an overview of the state of play on the sections in those texts, which he just announced will be up on the website later on today if it's not already. It's clear that that document is very thorough in some areas, and such as shared vision and response measures, and very sparse in others, such as legal form, where there's only 4 bullets as opposed to 10 or 12 pages of text. So it's uneven, unbalanced at this point, but as he said, it's a snapshot and it needs to be filled in as we go forward next week. On the Kyoto Protocol, I think the options are becoming clearer, as I'll discuss in a minute, but environmental integrity in the rules is very important, and Melanie and Eva will be discussing 2 of the most important loopholes or concerns we have about that. Negotiators are continuing to work to try to finalize agreements where they can on these issues, but of course many of these issues are very political and will be left for ministers who are now starting to arrive in Durban to work out next week. Just a couple of points on the big issues on the future of the Kyoto Protocol and the broader long-term legal regime. Discussions are continuing between the European Union and the G77 in China. The EU has made clear that it's prepared to put a ratifiable agreement for a second commitment period of Kyoto on the table, but only as part of a broader package that includes some process to develop a more comprehensive and ambitious long-term regime over time. The G77 in China, I think, are more clear now about what those conditions mean and exactly what the EU will need to stay in Kyoto, so that's good. Clarity is always good, but there's not agreement. They need to continue to have discussions on that issue. You may have just heard in the stock-taking plenary, the chair of the LCA, of the AWG-KP said that amendment and ratification of a second commitment period before 2013 are clearly not possible at this point. We've already run out of time for that, but there are several options still on the table. One would be a 2-stage process where you get a decision and a package of amendments on the Kyoto Protocol agreed here in Durban, with ratification to come later and probably linked politically to progress on the convention track. You could also have a decision only without amendments being adopted here, or you could just have a political declaration, which would be the weakest form. And of course, we don't think a decision or a declaration are the paths that ought to be taken. We think there needs to be a decision and a package of amendments and have that move out of here for ratification with provisional application until ratification is complete. He's clearly on the issue of converting the pledges or targets that developed countries have put on the table into what's called KELROs, Quantified Emission Limitation and Reduction Objectives. That is not complete, and there are different ways of proceeding on that as well. Turning to the LCA side, the deal becomes more complicated because you not only have the EU and the G77, but you have my country, the United States, in the mix. So it's a three-way negotiation as opposed to a two-way. The United States, as we've said earlier, has put out unacceptable preconditions on legal symmetry, on graduation of developing countries into binding commitments, and on no conditionality of developing country commitments on provision of finance and technology. All three of those are red line issues for the developing countries. And collectively, they make it clear that the U.S. is not serious about wanting to negotiate a legally binding agreement when you put those kind of preconditions on the table as a starting point for even going into negotiations. So here the key issues are, can the European Union, the G77, and China reach agreement on a package deal on what happens on the Kyoto side versus what happens on the LCA side going forward? And if they can reach agreement, will it be something that the United States can accept rather than try to block at the end of the day? The small island states and the least developed countries have tabled formal decision text in the LCA working group on legal issues, but we understand, we weren't in the room yesterday because it was an informal as opposed to an informal. We hear that that was blocked from being put into the amalgamated text that Chairman Riefschneider put out this morning by the United States and some other countries. We're still trying to confirm exactly who said what and why, but you'll see when you look at the LCA text, those proposals, which were formally tabled, are not in that text. Finally, on finance, this is the other big political issue, I think, here. It's clear that an agreement on the Green Climate Fund is possible. And you may have just heard the presidency is conducting informal consultations in a representative group of countries on that key issue, because that is clearly a deliverable that she wants and South Africa wants to have at the end of this meeting as a benchmark for progress. But it's clearly also linked to the other major issue of long-term finance. How are we going to ramp up finance towards the $100 billion commitment made in Copenhagen? And there we understand the United States continues to have concerns about any other countries, developing countries, having any say about what developed countries do to meet that political commitment that was made in Copenhagen. So that's sort of the overall state of play, and let me now turn it over to Melanie to talk about the LULUCF loophole issue.